our next speaker, I'll be introducing Evie Brockwell. So, after breaking her hip and living alone during the pandemic, Evie took the leap at 24 to start her business and travel the world. So from this, Evie has worked with top travel brands like Booking.com and TUI, Megabus, etc., sharing her knowledge to inspire product excellence. She's here to bring us the sunshine, and so please put your hands together and welcome Evie to the stage.
Thank you. Hello, hello. Yeah, that intro kind of ended abruptly when you said sunshine, because that's definitely not come with me. So sorry about that, everyone. But thank you. I'm going to start with a question. Who here works in product? Okay, pretty much all of you, so that's okay. If you don't work in product, I'm going to talk about some product-related things, but this applies to absolutely anyone. So yeah, feel free to apply it anyway, and maybe you'll just have a laugh at product people along the way. And who's here because they feel like they're just really busy all of the time? Okay, yeah, about 50% of you. The rest of you, maybe you don't need the talk. But this is a state that appears with every product person I know. And last week, I onboarded a new client. And whenever I onboard a new client, I go through and I have a conversation with everyone. We have one-to-ones and we talk about different things. And I'm always like, okay, what are your biggest fears? What are your pain points and what are your desires? And whenever I talk about pain points, the main thing that comes up for everyone is that they have too many meetings. And I think that's something that's familiar for everyone in this room. I also hosted a workshop on burnout last week, and the same thing happened. I was chatting to one of the product people, and they're running 2 different product teams. They've got 3 projects, and they don't feel like they have time to do it all. And I think we're always trying to add so much impact in product, but we don't feel like we have the time available to us to do the things that are really going to make a difference. And I used to be the same. I was this person in product, and when I first started, I would walk around with my laptop and my coffee, and I'd be going from meeting to meeting like this, and everyone's asking me questions like, Evie, could you work on this thing? And I'm like, no, sorry, I'm too busy. And then everyone's like, how was your week at work? And I'm always like, busy. And that seems to be the standard product owner response. We're always too busy for anything else that comes our way. And it's true, like, we're not just exaggerating. Like, we do like to feel important, we do like to feel powerful, and we do like to be involved in everything. But we also know that we need to start carving out time to work on the things that we really want to do. So things that Janet was talking about this morning. How do you do strategy? How do you make sure you've got the right KPIs? How do you make sure you're taking those steps to the left to move everyone in the right direction? And often we don't find the time to really think about and do those things. So that's what I'm going to be sharing with you all today. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my journey. So I went on this, oh, I'm so busy, I'm so powerful, I'm in all of these meetings in product. And what ended up happening is my diary looked like this. And this is a genuine snapshot from like 2021. We can see I've got an hour free here. I've got like 15 minutes free on a Wednesday and a Thursday. And I've got 3 meetings like booked in all at once on a regular occurrence. And this isn't an exception. This was the norm. I used to have my alarm go off at 6:30. I'd start working from 7 till 9. I'd do everything before everyone else would come online. And then this was during COVID. So at like 5:30, I'd log off. I'd pour myself a gin and tonic. I'd go and sit and watch what Boris had to say about what was changing tomorrow. And then I'd get back on my laptop and carry on working. And I was on this pattern on repeat for so long. And then I hit the point where I was like, I can't keep doing this. I'm trying to do all of these things. I'm leading 5 different teams. I'm trying to carve out time to make an impact. And I'm like, when? When is that going to happen? So I took a step back from everything and I was like, okay, what strategies can I actually put in place to make a change? And they're the kind of things that I'm going to talk to you guys about today. But it was a combination of 2 things. It was like, what can I do with my time? But also, what can I do with the organization overall? And what I found recently is that I've been working with a bunch of different product people, and I had this hypothesis that maybe 50% of product people have experienced burnout. So earlier this year, I started to do some research, and I was like, let's find out if that number is true, because everyone's diary looks like this. And through a poll of like 200 and something product people, I found that 92% of product people have either experienced burnout or they've been on the edge of it. And the even more scary statistic is that for 72% of people, that had happened more than once. So even if we manage to get ourselves out of these cycles, we then fall back into this pattern of trying to do more, take on more, feeling the pressure of our organizations, and we don't know what to do about it. So hopefully, what you guys are going to learn today are some key strategies that you can take away to actually go and make some changes. I've got another question for you all, and you can just think about this one in your heads. But what's your favourite thing about going to a product conference? Just have a little think. For me, my favourite thing is never like going to the talks and people say, oh, this is how we did this at this place. And I'm like, cool, Joe, great, good for you. But that doesn't work in my organisation. But the things that I do find really impactful, and I heard some people say this after Janet's talk today, they're like, oh my God, this is so inspiring. We could try this thing and we could do this thing. And that's what I want you all to leave thinking is like, okay, next week I can go away and I can actually make some actions to make this stuff better. So it's going to be a bit interactive. If you haven't already, make sure you've either got a phone out or like a pad and some paper, because I'm going to be asking you guys some questions and be getting you to do a bit of reflection on things that are happening for you so that you can really go away and be like, I've got this one change that I'm going to make next week. So the bits that we're going to be covering today are how you're spending your time and why you're spending your time like that. We're also going to talk about different techniques that you can use to carve out ways to improve the way that you spend your time and the way that your organization's working. And finally, we're going to talk about how you can actually influence other people because, as we've spoken about today, from a lot of the talks, you can't always do everything because you're not always in control. So we'll talk about a few ways that you can help to drive change in your organization. So, time. This is where I'm going to get you guys to start writing a few things down. And the first question that I have for you, hopefully you can all see this okay, is what are the 5 main activities that you're spending your time on? And I want you to get quite specific. So don't just be like, oh, meetings. Think about really which meetings are you in all of the time. And you can think back to the last quarter. You can have a look through your calendar right now if that's not too scary for you. And think about where have you really been spending a bunch of your time. It looks like a lot of people are still writing, or maybe you've just been a bit distracted by WhatsApp notifications, because that's usually what happens to me. And one of the ways that I've actually saved myself a bunch of time is that I turned all of my social media notifications off so that I stop procrastinating, and that makes a massive difference. So if you're not already doing that, I'd recommend it. The next question I have for you is what are the 5 main activities that you would actually want to spend your time on? So if you think about your role and your responsibilities, where are you actually going to drive value? What are the 5 activities that you should be doing to actually create impact in your role? Okay, does everyone have about 5 down? Sweet. Don't worry if you've not got 5, you can always go away. And I've also got a little worksheet at the end that I've linked to that will give you like a bunch of activities, a few activities that you can do in a really short space of time to map out some of these things and make a difference. So yeah, if you don't have 5, don't worry. But who's got 100% of a match? So who's spending? Just put your hands up. Exactly 100. Not exactly 100% of your time, but who's spending time on the activities that are really going to add impact over those 2 lists? Who's got 100% match? Okay, no one. Who's got a few A few that overlap. You're spending time on. Perfect. Okay, good. And who's got none? Okay, a few hands here. Like, you're the ones that we need to speak to, so come to me afterwards if you want any help. But for everyone, there's clearly a shift that we can make to go from where we're spending our time now to what we should actually be doing to drive change and drive the things that we want to. So I've got another question for you here, and I want you to shout out some of these answers. What are the main reasons that you're not doing that already? So what's stopping you from spending time on the things that will actually add the impact? Great one, love that. I'm like, that one sounds very familiar. I'll talk about that one in a second. Any others? Yeah, honestly, meetings stop you from being able to do the things that you want to do. And again, we'll talk about that when we talk about organizational design and also how you can influence some of these things yourself. Anything else? Yep, all the time. We're always like running to the most important thing, and it's like we don't have the time to solve the root cause of those problems, so we're just firefighting all of the time. What was the other one? Yep, that's also a very good one. I've not popped that one down here, but well, kind of. I'll talk about that one in a second, but it's something that we all need to remember is like we can control this and we can have that discipline. And it kind of leads me to this first point. So we often don't do this because we're like, "Oh, these things are hard. The things that we actually need to be doing, we don't quite know how to do them. Like, oh, I need to create a strategy. How do I do that? And we don't want to take the time to do it. We don't know how to break it down into the smallest thing that's going to be easy. We'd rather run to all of the easy work. And I've got an example from like my own personal life. I have a camper van, which is great, but I'm not very good with shapes and angles, which isn't so great when you're driving up hills that are like this in first gear and some locals have to help you reverse back down because you get stuck. But that's not the point. I also have to do different things like fill up the water. And in the camper van, I've got like this hose that connects to the water tank. And because I'm not very good with shapes, and honestly, a 5-year-old could do this, you need to screw the hose onto a tap. And when you're in Europe, all of the fittings are a little bit different. And I needed to do this one day. My boyfriend had gone to the shop to buy some water, and I'm trying to fit this tap, and I'm like, it's not working. I try some different fittings, it's still not working. So I just gave up. I went in the van and I was like, I'm going to do the easy tasks that I can do. I'm going to clean it, I'll do the washing up, I'll do the easy things. My boyfriend comes back and he's like, why haven't you done the water yet? That was the number one thing I was meant to do. I'm like, oh, I just couldn't do it. Within 30 seconds, he'd managed to screw this hose on. It was the easiest task in the world, but because I told myself it was going to be hard and that I'm not very good at these things, I chose to go and do other things instead. And we do this so much more often than you think. There's research that has shown that 20 to 30% of your workday is spent doing the easy tasks because we have task completion bias. And we'd rather feel like we've got shit done than work on the things that are actually going to drive change. So whenever you're distracting yourself and you've not got that discipline and you're procrastinating, always remember that you can do this stuff. You're probably just putting it off because it seems a bit more difficult. The next one, we feel like there's no option sometimes. So this is some of the stuff like my boss has told me to, or our meetings, or my teams need me, so I have to run to this thing. And again, an example of this. We do this again in our real life all of the time. So when I was traveling to the conference on Wednesday, I flew here from Italy. I'm spending the next 2.5 months in the UK, so it's all good. I was coming back for a reason anyway. But my flight was delayed by 2 hours. And I'd already booked my train to come here. So I was like, it's fine. My train was booked for like 2.5 hours after my flight was meant to land. I was like, it's cool. Eventually, we took off 2.5 hours late. We managed to make up some time in the air. And we landed at 10:30, and my train was at 10:46, and I'm at Gatwick Airport, and I'm like, do I think I can make this? And then some other people got off the plane and they started to run. And I was like, do you know what? I'm going to join them. So there was this like little sprint crew, and everyone's like dawdling around Gatwick Airport. They're like with their suitcases, and we're all darting through, like, I've got this. And I got to passport control, made it through, got to the train station, and I made it in 21 minutes, which I'm pretty proud of to say that I broke my hip a few years ago, as I mentioned at the start, and I can't really run anymore. But it turns out I'd missed my train, and I was like, okay, great. I'll wait for the next one. And time was getting closer and closer. And then I was like, okay, I'm on the train to Farringdon, and this train's also getting delayed by 2 minutes. And I'm like, there's every chance I've got about 6 minutes to make the train that I need to get here. So we get to Farringdon, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to make sure that I can get onto the tube as quick as possible. So I line myself up right next to the escalator, and I'm straight up, and I get to the tube. And literally that noise started as I got there, where it's like, and the doors are starting to close. And if anyone lives in London, you have this moral dilemma where you're like, I could still get on the tube right now, but you don't want to be that dickhead where you get the doors stuck. So I was like, oh shit, I'm gonna have to wait. And then I'm like, okay, if I get this next tube, I've literally got 2 minutes to get to the train. And I'm like, well, I've already missed these 2 connections that I thought I was going to make. Like, can I really do it? And again, my boyfriend always tells me 2 things. He says, we're not lazy and we're not quitters. So I was like, do you know what? All right, I'm going to give this my best shot. So as the tube's lining up, I've got 2 people stood next to me waiting to get off. And I'm right in the middle. So I'm like the first one when the doors open. Everyone's looking at me like I'm crazy. I literally sprinted all the way up the escalator. And it turns out I'm at platform 11. I'm like, why is it the furthest one away? It's always like that, isn't it? So I'm running all the way through the airport. And I'm so out of breath. I'm like, God, I need to do more cardio. And I'm like, why am I doing this? I'm probably going to miss it anyway. But I didn't. I made it on that train with 20 seconds to spare. And it's because I thought there was an option. I was having this moral dilemma in my head the whole way, being like, will I make it? Will I not? But it turns out if you really believe that you can do something, if you believe you can drive that change, you'll go for it and you'll try and make it happen. But if you tell yourself you can't, if you're like, it's too impossible to change these meetings, everyone needs me in these different sessions, there's no way that anyone will listen to me if I try and change it, you won't make a difference. So that's my little inspirational story from running to catch a train, just to remember that there is always an option. So if you tell yourself that, you'll probably be more likely to drive this change. Other people. So this is about your boss. I had a manager who I absolutely hated working with for quite a long time, but we all know they're in charge of your bonus, they're in charge of your promotion, so you try and impress them. And I'd turn up to a one-to-one with him every 2 weeks, and I'd leave that one-to-one with a list of about 20 different things that I had to do. And then I'd go back to my one-to-one again the next week, well, in 2 weeks' time, and I've done all these 20 things, and I sit down and I'm like, so I've done all of this. And he's like, why have you done that? I didn't ask you to do that. I'm like, yes, you did. And this was before we had note takers. I'm going to take note takers to every single meeting for the rest of my life so that no one can ever tell me that, like, that's not what I was meant to do. But it got to the point where I was like, do you know what? I'm just going to stop doing what he asks me to do and see what happens. And it turns out nothing happened. Maybe he'd remind me and he's like, well, I thought you were meant to do that thing. And I'm like, oh, yeah, I didn't have time. I'll go and do it now. But we always think that we have to do this stuff because other people expect it from us. But actually, that's not true. We can make a change. And I know some bosses are more difficult than that, but that's why we'll talk about powers of influencing people and all these other bits. But again, just a reminder to say, even if you feel like you can't, often you can. And then the last bit, business chaos. And this is often where those things like meetings come from. Because as we were talking about this morning, you can work in these spaces that are like pure product operating model and everything works like this utopia and everyone's really happy. But the reality is for most of us, we work in these organizations where we've got meetings all of the time. We've got all of these silos. We're changing direction constantly and no one knows what's going on. And that's the stuff where like you can't necessarily change that directly yourself, but the things that you can look at in your organization as a whole to make an impact. So, is everyone in a position where we're like, yeah, okay, we feel comfortable, like we think we can change some of these things? Because the important thing that you need to do is remember this. Are you willing to put the important before the urgent? And this was the chat that we were having in the burnout workshop, was that people are always busy fighting these fires and doing the urgent things, and we're never going to drive that impactful change unless we put some of the urgent on hold and we focus on the important stuff. If anyone hasn't read this book, it's quite a good book and it's dirt cheap on Apple Books if anyone other crazy person likes reading from their phone. And he's also got one that's called 10 times is easier than 2 times, which is quite a good book where you can think about how you could do some strategy. So recommend that if you've not already seen this. So if you are willing to put the important before the urgent, this is how we're going to go and take control. And this is what I'll link to in the worksheet at the end, where there's a bit more insight on how you can do some of these things. But basically, what you can go through and think about is where you're spending your time. Are you spending your time on areas that have got high impact and they don't take so long? Or are you spending all of your time on areas that don't really have that much impact and it's taking you a shit ton of time? Because that's the stuff we want to get rid of. And there's 4 different ways that I recommend that people do this. The first is just delete it. So there was a guy that was a product leadership coach in one of my first jobs, and everyone thought this was so outrageous. This was when everyone used email for everything all of the time. And he was like, Yeah, when I come back from holiday, I have an out of office on that just says, I'm not going to respond to your email. If you email me whilst I'm on holiday, your email will get deleted. And he would genuinely get back on his first day of his holiday, and he wouldn't spend all of his time going through his emails. He would just delete his whole inbox. And to all of us, that sounds outrageous, right? You're like, could you imagine doing that? But he did, and it worked, and he set that boundary to say that's how he was going to operate. So even if we think that there are these things that we can't really change, you can. You can do more extreme stuff. You can delete everything. So there are loads of different examples about ways that you might be able to do that. You could delete meetings. You could stop sending certain reports. You can just get rid of stuff that isn't really adding any value. And then if you don't feel like you can delete things, you could also try these different approaches. So you could try delegating things. I wouldn't recommend delegating anything that's taking a lot of time because it'll take a lot of time for someone else. But if it's stuff where actually like someone else could do it better than you, and another great example of this and one that I like to use in every team that I work with is as product people, we think we need to write all of the JIRA tickets. It was like in the product owner job that you write tickets. But that's not true. In most of the teams that I've worked with, when the developers are the ones writing the tickets, we do such better work because they get all of the context and they're inputting into what that solution should be. So even in situations like that, if someone's not reporting into you, you can still delegate out some of these tasks and improve your workflow overall. Um, the same if you've got analysts or UX people or UX researchers. Have a think about what you're doing and what you're spending your time on and what other people might be able to help you with. And if you, again, can't delegate, or if you're working on stuff where you're like, this doesn't make any sense to delegate because it's taking way too much time for anyone, have a think about how you can do some other stuff. So can you automate anything? So obviously we've got AI now. I use ChatGPT for so many things. Like I can input loads of notes. I have an AI note-taking tool, and I can input all of that into ChatGPT, and it can spit out summaries for me of anything that I want. And I know that not everyone can use that in their organization, but are there tools like that that you can use? Or can you use any Jira automations? Or can you automate anything in Slack? And if you're not sure, what I did was I came up with a list of things that were taking me loads of time. And I went to my development team and I'm like, hey, like I'm doing all of these things and they take loads of time. Do you have any ideas of automizations? They usually have loads. So get other people to help you with that if you need to. And then the last thing that you can do is work out how you can streamline stuff. So do you need that meeting every week or can it be every 2 weeks? Does it have to be a meeting? Could you just send out a report? Does the report need to be this bespoke thing where you pull from all of these different slide decks, or can you just present a Miro screen to people that if that's what they need to see? So have a think about how you can free up some of your time in those ways. And that's all of the stuff that you're in control of. So it might be meetings that you own, it might be your own diary, it might be some of those things. But there's other things that are happening in your organization where it might not feel that way. Because sometimes the organization is just fundamentally fucked. Like the conversations that we were in just before where we were talking about public sector digital and all of these things that you have to do. And it can be a lot more challenging to drive and make these changes. So does anyone have any examples from your own organizations where actually it's organizational structure stuff that just means it's chaos? Yeah? Talk to me later. I'm happy to have the vent. Anyone else? So a lot of the examples that I've seen from this in organizations, and I'll talk about how we can do this properly in a minute, are things like constantly changing strategy and direction, or spinning up new teams every 3 months and you've not got a runway to get started. Or you've got so many silos and so many different people that you need to communicate with that you have to spend your whole life in meetings. So there are different things you can do in that space, which comes down to a lot of the stuff that Janet was talking about earlier about how to structure an organization effectively to drive some of that change. So I'm going to give you an example of what I think is like product utopia. And it's going to seem a bit like, well, maybe I can't do all of those things, which is likely to be true. But I did implement all of this with a client last year, and I've implemented elements of this in different organizations that I've worked with. So there's always things, and this is what Holly was talking about yesterday, there's always stuff you can do, and it's not about trying to get it perfect, it's just about us trying to take steps towards what that utopia might look like. So the first thing that I think is super beneficial to a lot of organizations that can help save a bunch of time is having a clear strategic direction. So I'm not going to bang on too much about strategy or what any of those things are, because Janet covered it superbly this morning. But the reason why strategic direction can save you time is that you stop changing approach and priorities every single quarter. Everyone's bought into that longer term vision, and they're trying to all take strides to make sure they get there. The other benefit of this in terms of saving time is that you can coordinate a bunch of teams around it. So you've not got one department saying, well, this is our strategy and we're doing this, and another department trying to go in a completely different route where it doesn't line up. So you don't just want your own like product strategic direction, you want that to be aligned across the whole company. And granted, if you're not in a product leadership position, this can be quite hard to influence, but there are ways that you can start to have those conversations with your manager or their manager and speak to other people to say, well, I feel like we're spending a lot of time going down this approach and then switching. Is there something else we can try and do to try and give us a bit more sustainability and mean that we can keep going in one direction? One Direction, I'm always like, you can't say that without thinking of the band, can you? Clear OKRs. So you don't have to use OKRs, but having some sort of outcome that you guys are working towards can be really, really helpful. And again, when I found this the most beneficial is when I've worked in organizations where you've got a product function and then you've got other stakeholders that sit around it. And all of these other stakeholders want a million and one different things from you. And none of it really aligns to what you're trying to achieve. And the most effective conversation that I found in that space is to just get everyone on board and say, like, hey, this is what we're all trying to work towards as an organization. These are the outcomes that we're trying to drive. Has anyone got anything that's going to help contribute to this and help us move in this direction? If they don't, if they've got a bunch of ideas, but it's not really helping you stay on track, you can do more of that educational piece and that conversational piece to say, like, well, that stuff's not really going to be impactful at this point in time because it's not helping us to achieve these things. So it stops a lot of the noise and it stops a lot of the conversations that I think we spend a lot of our time having as product people to go and say no to people. It's like a much easier way to say, well, no, it's not going to actually have the impact that we're trying to achieve right now. So sorry. And then the next most important thing is about how we structure teams. And there's two main things that I think are important in this space. And one of them, and again, Janet was alluding to this morning, is making sure that you have the right people involved. So if you've got that clear direction and you've got the clear OKRs, you don't always just need an engineer, a product person, a UX designer, and that setup. You might need to have someone from legal heavily involved. You might need someone from customer success to sit in your team. And if these are the people you're working with on a regular basis and they're not more embedded, you again spend all of your time having these alignment conversations and bringing people on board and trying to get them brought in when they might be trying to go in a different direction. So if you know you're working with these people a lot of the time, can you bring them into your planning meetings? Can they attend a couple of stand-ups each week? Can they feel like an extension of the team that you already have so that you're not spending your time moving around different spaces and trying to do things? And then the other most important thing, and this one again can be a bit more difficult if you're not fully in control of it, is how you structure and set up these teams to be successful. And again, the best organizations that I've worked with, okay, let me give you the worst ones first. The worst organizations that I've worked with are ones where it's like, okay, we have a team that looks after this page, and a team that looks after this page, and a team that looks after this page. And then you have your strategy and your OKRs, and only one of those teams is actually working on stuff that's important. The other two just have this domain knowledge, so they're just doing things, but it's not actually driving you to where you want to go. But the best organizations are the ones that set up those teams to align to the strategy. And there's a really good, I'll link to this at the end and I can share the slides if anyone emails me afterwards. There's a really good YouTube video about Hotjar and how Hotjar did this, because they constantly would set up their teams to focus on strategic goals as opposed to elements of domain knowledge. And there's also examples where you might have team 1, 2, and 3 that are working on really important things, but they're dependent on team 4 for everything that they need to do. And team 4 becomes a blocker. So again, you want to think about things like, well, can we actually get people to send in merge requests to team 4 and they can actually work on that code base? Or can we put more people on team 4 to enable more of these teams to do some other stuff? So some improvements you can make there. And again, it saves you time because you can deliver more impact by working on the important stuff. And you're not all wasting time by trying to figure out like, oh, let's help team 3 do this thing that's not actually going to be important. Another one, just-in-time roadmaps. So who here has worked at an organization where you've been asked to create a delivery plan for the next like 2 to 5 years with dates? Yep, quite familiar. And who here has actually gone through and executed that delivery plan down to a T? It's a waste of time. Like, there is no point. And when I'm totally brutal about roadmaps and backlogs, my honest opinion is if you have more than 5 things on a backlog, you're probably not going to do the rest of them. Something else that's more important usually comes through and takes its place. So if you're talking about any of these features, and I'm not saying don't talk about these things at all, because sometimes we work in these organizations where we do need to plan further ahead, or we do need to talk about strategic priorities or know what's coming up next to know how we're going to get there. But we don't need all of that detail. We don't need to have sized it. We don't need to know exactly what those requirements are. We don't need to be having conversations and stakeholder alignment over things that might not happen. So figure out what the right cadence is for your organization and how much planning in the future you need to do to make sure that you're actually having the impact that you want. And then continuous stakeholder collaboration. So like I said, one of the options is that you can bring people into your teams and align them a little bit more. But for anyone that you're not doing that with, what's the best way to collaborate with them? Sometimes people just have a meeting with stakeholders every 2 weeks where it's like, hey, here's a report, here's an update, or no one reads these things. So how can you figure out ways to bring your stakeholders into the conversation that are actually going to add impact, where they actually get the direction you're trying to go in and they buy into that and they support you and you all work together towards the same goals? Whereas again, in a lot of organizations, it's kind of us versus them. We all see our stakeholders as our enemy and we're like, oh, they're just trying to take us off track and they don't get products. And if you feel that way, there's probably reasons why. Why don't they get product? Why don't they agree with your direction? What is it that they truly care about and need to understand to mean that they do feel like they're engaged, to mean that they do feel like they can move in the same direction as you? So yeah, they're the 5 things I would recommend you go away and think about working on. And for some of you, it might be easier to influence some of these things, or there might be direct actions you can take from some of those that help you make a difference. For others, it might be a lot more difficult. You're like, I can't do any of this. This is a complete waste of time. Thanks for your talk, Evie, but I'm not going to be able to do anything. So what I also, before I get to that point, I'll tell you why this is important. Forget the important stuff. But when I implemented all of this with an organization, this was the impact that we had. So we managed to hit 80% of the OKRs for 2 quarters in a row. We managed to increase team engagement by 23%. So before I started, we had this little engagement survey and everyone's frustrated because they're like, yeah, we love collaboration, but we spend all of our time in meetings and this is really shit. And we don't quite know what's going on, but we don't feel like we're involved. And it was all of these different pieces of politics that we were trying to bring together. And by implementing that kind of structure where people felt like they get it and they were engaged, we managed to increase team engagement by 23%. And we also managed to increase efficiency. And when I talk about efficiency, it's not just about getting work done, but it's about actually delivering impactful work. So 12%, we had a 12% increase in the work that we were delivering that actually made a difference, that actually increased the results of that company. So this stuff does work. It's not always the easiest to get there, but it really does make a difference. Cool. So if you don't feel like you are in a position where you can just directly do this stuff, you need to be able to influence change. Again, a question for you all. How do we make decisions? What would you guys say? If you needed to influence anyone, what would you do? Anyone? Evidence, yep. Any more? That's a great one. That's what I'm going to talk about. Most of the time, I used to say I'd use data. And that stuff does help. But what I've found as I've moved through my career is actually like we're not data-driven people. We like to think we are, but there's research that has shown that 90% of our decisions are based on emotions. We just use data to rationalize them and back them up. So data and evidence can really help, but you need to know how to use it. And I'm sure we've all been there. We all know that we can read numbers in a million different ways. We've all run experiments and we've been like, oh, kind of failed, kind of tanked. But I can pick out this one piece of data that's going to make it look really positive so I can look good again. Like we all do it. But the key is understanding the people and understanding what they care about. There's some other research that has shown why we make decisions based on emotions. So there was one study that went and looked at demo days that were run in Europe, and it assessed how many people won different pitches. And it found that when all else was equal, more people won pitches when it was sunny outside. Because when the weather's good, it influences our mood, and people were more likely to say yes and invest in them. And then there was another study where they managed to predict with an 87% accuracy who was going to win different pitches based on these things that they called honest signals. And honest signals are the way that we interact with people. So if you're smiling at people, if you're nodding your head, if you're building that kind of human rapport and interaction, then you're more likely to connect with people. And that made a bigger difference to who won the pitches, and they could predict this, than actually what was in that pitch content itself. So yes, evidence and that kind of thing can be useful, but actually so much more of it is about building that connection and being able to tap into people's emotions. So if you need to influence change, if you need to work with people on these things, these are some of the things that I recommend. Speak to those people that you need to work with. Get to know them, get to know what their true desires are. And you have to open up a bit of a vulnerable conversation with people. You have to be open to receiving feedback, and you have to genuinely want to know what they care about and try to get to the bottom of that. And if you can get to the bottom of that, you can use that to weave in your story and to tell them why what you want to change is going to be so much better. And again, what I found in some organizations, especially when you're trying to go on the product-led approach, is that we're over here because we all know, like Marty Kagan's told us, product-led is amazing. So we're like, you should all be product-led. You should be doing it like this. And everyone else is down here. And just because you're telling them this is great, they can't see that. They don't get that. You need to come and speak to them on their level and bring them on that journey with you. And if you're not able to do that, you'll usually create a divide in the organization. So yes, you need to be able to go and influence from their perspective. Understand what it is that they really care about. Understand what's going to make them feel good, what's going to make them look good, and make sure you're shaping the conversations around that to suggest why you should be doing some more of these things. And often, like I'll use meetings as an example. We often don't feel like we can change meetings because someone else put it in. But usually, if you feel this way, if you feel like this meeting's a waste of time and no one's getting any value, everyone else in that meeting probably feels the same. So you just need to tap into that and understand what it is that they really care about and what they want to know, and then use that to your advantage. So that was everything that I've been able to run through today. The things that we covered, so we spoke about your time, where you're spending your time and where you'd like to spend your time, why you're not doing that, and potentially we talked about techniques for things that you could potentially change to improve that. We've also spoken about the organisation and why that can create some friction with how we spend our time. And again, techniques that you could implement to try and change that. And then we spoke about how you could influence other people to help to achieve some of those things. As promised, I have linked to this QR code. If you go onto this, it has a few different worksheets that you'll be able to get your hands on. So you can go through and do an exercise on Monday morning where you can basically map out where you're spending your time right now, where you want to be spending your time, and how you can get that to happen. And then the one last question that I have for you all, and I want you all to write this down right now because we're more likely to take action if we write things down. But what's the one change that you're going to go in and try to make to either your time or the organization when you go back to work on Monday? Whilst you write that down, I'll pop onto the last slide because this one's got the link to the speaker survey. So if you do want to put any feedback on there, feel free to do so. And I've popped the other QR code up again if you didn't have time to scan it before. That's everything.
Thank you so much for that, Evie. That was absolutely incredible. And when I saw your calendar, I'm like, yep, I've got that feeling as well, where you're just like, oh my God, this is my week. Let's just worry about today.
Yep.
So, questions from the crowd. We've got plenty of time for questions. So who's got any burning questions for Evie that whilst we've got her?
Job done.
Sounds like you smashed it. Well, if anyone has any follow-up questions, oh, hold on, we have one.
Do you know what? So my boyfriend always laughs because I wore these in Manchester and I literally had like two women run after me down the street. I was like, oh my God, I'm going to get kidnapped. And this woman's like, I just need to ask, where are your trousers from? They're actually from like Sheen or Shine. I never know how you call it, but from like 2 years ago. So I don't know if you can get them anymore.
Oh, there's a question over there.
When you took that screenshot of your calendar, are you still at that organisation? And did change happen there, or did you move somewhere else and then you made changes?
Great question. Yes, I should have elaborated on that more at the start. So This is when I worked at booking.com, and I think it's a great organization to work at if you want to do product really, really well. But it's very intense, and it's like that's what my calendar looked like all of the time. And I made change at that point in time, and I think that's probably why I took that screenshot, is because I was like, that was my wake up week where I was like, I can't keep doing this. And this is why I started to talk about burnout a lot more, because when I hit that point, I wasn't sleeping properly. I had eczema all over my body, and I knew that I couldn't keep functioning like that. So I took a whole day out of my diary. I don't know if it was that week or maybe like the week after. I just deleted all of my meetings and I called in sick. And what I did was I spent that whole day reviewing exactly what was going on and making a plan based on those actions that I just told you about, to say, well, what can I delegate? What can I get rid of? What can I streamline? And I really started to make a change. And I also identified the things that we needed to improve in the organisation to help with some of that. And a lot of one of the biggest problems that we had was that we would have OKRs all of the time, and they were really helpful. But we would spend a month embedding the OKRs with the teams and starting to make progress. Then we'd have a month to do work. And then we'd go back into this crazy planning cycle, and we'd spend a whole month trying to set our next OKRs again. And it was just ridiculous. So we started to embed some of those changes and work out again who to influence to make a difference in that space. So I did a lot of that whilst I was still there, but then that's when I left and was like, do you know what? I'm really enjoying this organizational change stuff. I'm going to go into consultancy. So since I've like coached over 50 product people with those kind of techniques and helped 12 product organizations to implement the same kind of stuff. So I can say that it definitely works in a lot of different places.
Cool. Any other questions? I had a quick question, which was around, you mentioned about kind of bad bosses, or if you've got a boss who's a little bit intimidating, and you mentioned about kind of trying to cut things back, or you've got the choice of saying, actually, no, I can't make this meeting. What are the kind of coping mechanisms or tips and advice that you would give to people who have that type of person in their organization?
Yeah, so it can be really hard, especially when it's your manager, because you want to impress them and you feel like everything that you're doing depends on how that person perceives you, which is true to a certain extent. But I think there's a couple of things you can do. Well, multiple. And it depends. Like, you need, as per everything in product, you have to understand that person and what you need to do. But what I try to do with these people is like have that vulnerable conversation to talk about, why is this stuff impacting you? Why is it really hard for you to try and do everything that they're asking you for right now? And what impact is it having on like your personal life, your health, any of those things? But also present suggestions. Like, I actually think it might be better if we try doing this thing. And one of the techniques that can work really well in that space is phrasing it as an experiment. So like, can we spend 2 weeks where we try and work like this instead, and see how that works? See if you're getting what you want and if I'm getting what I want at the same time. So you can do some of those things. If you feel like you can't really influence that person, what I recommend is trying to find other mentors and bosses in the organization that can support you, because often there are good people that work there. And if you can have like one-to-ones with someone else instead, it can help with your sanity, and it can also help coach you in the right direction. But it also means that you feel like not your whole reputation is based on what your manager thinks about you, because there's other senior people that might perceive you in a different light if you're doing things slightly differently. So they're the couple that I would recommend starting with.
Oh, we have another question.
It's really bright here, so I'm like moving over.
Thank you. On the subject of influencing change, could you expand on the honest signaling that you were talking about, besides just having a nice smile?
Yes, which helps. The smile helps. But they're basically these natural human interactions. So I've linked, again, if you pop me, I've not popped my email address up, but you can find me on LinkedIn. If you drop me a message, I can share these slides as well, because I've popped the whole like book and study in the back. But it's basically all of these natural interactions that you learn from the age of being a baby. So the way that you create eye contact with people, the way that you smile at people, the way that you really connect with everyone that's around you. It's trying to do those kind of things and having the open body language and all of those positive things we're taught to do. If you're going into that space, you're more likely to make that connection and have that impact. Obviously, if the person on the receiving end is giving you the opposite, like no eye contact, deadpan face, like arms folded, it's like, how do you try and crack that and build that rapport? And that can honestly be the hardest part. But that's where I recommend sometimes having that conversation with someone and being like, hey, Is everything okay? What's going on for you? You look like you're a bit pissed off about something. Why don't you tell me what that is? Like sometimes you just have to be really honest and tell people what you're experiencing from their behavior.
Well, great. Time for one more question. No, I think we're all good. Well, Evie's going to be sticking around, so if you've got any follow-up questions, feel free to grab her after this. But yeah, that's all we've got time for. And yeah, it's lunchtime now. Go and get some lunch. And another round of applause.